Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another lecture in our series on migration and security from the Institute of European Studies. Tonight's theme is security, diversity, and human rights with Nicolas Berger and Tugba Basaran. For those of you who are not des fidèles, my name is Peter Berger from the Institute for European Studies and the International Peace Research Institute in Oslo. And this entire project is, of course, a collaboration between the Institute and the Institute here in Brussels and my Institute in Oslo. It is the 6th lecture in a series of 13, so we're halfway along the way. Next week, 4th of November, the theme is citizenship and migration, with Jeff Huysmans and a discussion to be disclosed. Tonight, as I said, we have Tugba Basaran and Nicolas Berger. Tugba Basaran is a lecturer here up the road at the University of Kent. She teaches on security and international development. She holds a PhD in international studies from the University of Cambridge and has also studied at Sciences Po in Paris and at the Free University in Berlin. Nicolas Berger is director of Amnesty International European Office, formerly director of European Peacebuilding Liaison Office in prevention field, you can say. Before that, a member of the Civil Society Contact Group. He has a bachelor's and master's from Canterbury University in New Zealand and a PhD from the University of Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis. We decided by a draw of straws that Tugba would begin tonight, and then Nicolas Berger would follow up, and then there'll be time, as usual, for discussion and questions. So I give it to Basaran, who will stay there. Sorry.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to introduce today some reflections on law and human rights, essentially a problematization of law in liberal democracies. In liberal democracies, we are often used to a certain conception of law. Law is a guarantor of rights. Law is a strive for a just order, an almost teleological view of law preparing the path for justice. The more the legal order expands, the better it seems, leading to a continuing juridification of society. A lack of rights, on the other hand, is often attributed to the lack of law. There is a different view of law, however, one that has especially become relevant in the recent years. It is this law that justifies and legitimates security practices. Security practices that violate fundamental human rights. This is the aspect of law that I would like to concentrate on here today. Instances when law promotes violence and the neglect of rights, and even appears to approve of death. My explorations will be limited to liberal democracies and a specific use of law, legal borders. By legal borders, I'm looking at legal spaces of the sovereign state in which access to fundamental constitutional rights is restricted. Let me first specify that the legal space of the state is not only its territorial space, but rather correlates to the scope of its laws. But what exactly do I refer to here? Let me give some examples that you might be acquainted with. Waiting zones at airports and at ports of entry in general, interdiction at the high seas, and of course the most famous of them all, Guantanamo. What is common to all these legal spaces is that the liberal state employs illiberal praxis through the employment of law. How? In short, policing rights are legally secured, whilst constitutional rights, if they apply, are limited. Limited for a certain category of people held in determinate legal spaces. The usual defense of individuals against policing powers, common to the notion of liberal democracies, is violated. Lack of due process, lack of access to courts, detention are some of the effects of these legal practices. In the following, I will concentrate, following the lecture series, on these legal spaces in Europe in the context of migration. But let's keep in mind that this is not a unique European problem or applicable only to migration controls. It is essentially the problematization of law in liberal democracies. I will first of all start with a problematization of law in general, and later on discuss an empirical case to illustrate my point. Before starting our discussion, I'd like to explore a few notions of law that tend to penetrate common sense understandings, but also legal theory, and create a questionable nexus between law, order, violence, and exception. The basic assumption about law from which we proceed often in liberal democracies is that, first, law and order are positively correlated. Second, both are negatively correlated with violence. And third, follows as a consequence hereof, the discourse of exception that locates fundamental rights violations outside the liberal state or attributes those to a temporary crisis of the liberal state. Let me discuss these points more in detail. As for law and order, it is often assumed that law and order are positively correlated. Law appears to be a neutral force that guarantees order, reconciles conflicting interests, and autonomous space separate from political and social questions. In this context, the emphasis is on formal law and its institutions. This image is, of course, questionable. Of course, law creates a certain order, a normative order. It is, however, a peculiar order that needs to be put into a context of power relations that create, maintain, reproduce, and contest it. Order is not a good in itself. Questions of economical, political, and social order are highly political questions. The positive correlation of formal law and order is rather doubtful. Orders without formal law are, as any sociologist or anthropologist will confirm, often also the norm. More importantly, however, for our understanding of law is another assumption that follows from the law and order discourse. It is assumed that, whilst law and order are positively correlated, they are negatively correlated with violence. Law appears to contain violence. Does it? In much of jurisprudence and common sense notions, law appears as an apparent opposite to violence. The threat of force, quote, the threat of force provides a constant justification and apology for law. Law's own violence appears as a necessity to preserve peace and order. Of course, history casts a white shadow on law as a tool for preventing violence. Law has served as a framework for violence in many authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. Let's just think of colonial violence or the Nazi regime. Of course, we could argue that this is fundamentally different in liberal democracy, but is it? Is the violence of law substantially different from the violence that it prevents? Or does it merely function as a categorizing device, producing a distinction between legitimate and illegitimate violence? At times, it appears that law operates on the basis of a distinction of violence. Using these categorizations of legal and illegal, hence legitimate and illegitimate violence. It serves as a structuring mode for violence. In normative capacity, it seeks to distinguish between good, necessary violence and bad violence. The death toll of refugees and migrants in the Mediterranean is just a case in point how a legal operation can promote death. In this context, it is often state violence that appears to be lawful, justified, and legitimate, and individual violence deplorable and contestable. Given the previous assumptions about law, positive correlation between law and order on the one hand and the negative correlation towards violence on the other, a logical consequence are discourses of exception which have become common currency during the last few years to explain the violation of fundamental rights. Discourses of exception locate fundamental rights violations outside the liberal state or attribute those to a temporary crisis of the liberal state. A number of terms have proliferated: archipelagos of exception, spaces of exception, extraterritorial spaces, in-between spaces, states of exception. Exceptional in this sense refers not only to the lack of fundamental rights, but also the exceptionality in their constitution. These spaces appear to be constituted through exceptional law, the state of exception. Extra-legal approaches appear to be plainly lawless spaces. In discourses of exception, what is missing is a role for ordinary law, the rule of law. Placing illiberal rule outside of ordinary law and ordinary government has an important political function, of course. It serves to create a distinction between ordinary rule of law as the basis of the liberal state and exceptional situations, a temporary crisis of this norm, thus safeguarding an ideal type of the liberal state as a normative commitment. Further, as a consequence of this way of thinking, rule of law is proposed as a remedy to human rights violations. Whilst the argument of the exception tends to promote the view that liberal democracies can conquer spaces with limited fundamental rights, I think that the problem is more inherent to normal functioning liberal democracies. It is ordinary rule of law that is being applied in these legal spaces. This has an important impact. The threat of limited rights is not located outside, but within liberal democracies. Not limited to times of exception, but inherent to liberal rule. These are liberal security practices. And by liberal security practices, I refer to the nexus between illiberal practices and liberal rule established and maintained through ordinary law. As such, law is a tool of government that basically structures social life in modern societies. It's a tool for creation of social order, reflective of the power struggles in its constitution. It defines order and by implication disorder, the normal and the deviant, the inside and the outside, mobility and immobility, and the conditions of possibility for liberal and illiberal practices. Law identifies those to be dealt with as social problems in need of regulation, surveillance, and policing. It does so mainly by designating legal identities, such as, for example, citizen and non-citizen, and producing legal borders and spaces for the application of specific laws, such as anti-terrorism laws, migration laws, or the scope of application for constitutional rights. These legal practices allow for policing and define the disproportionate use of violence for specific instances. Analyzing practice of law in critical ways means understanding how law constitutes social structures, differentiations and borders, the constitutive powers of law, and understanding how ordinary law is constitutive of insecurity practices. In this sense, my interest here is to pursue an inquiry into a specific mode of violence legitimated through law, or more broadly, into the structures created through law to introduce a normative distinction in violence. My point of intervention here is the legal analysis of spaces in which fundamental rights are restricted through politics of borders and entry. How are these spaces legally constituted? Now, let me look at something more concrete. The politics of borders, legal spaces in the context of migration controls. The politics of borders and the distinction between inside and outside are an important practice of liberal states to offer limited rights. These politics of borders are based on law. Legal borders are strategically used to change the balance between security and liberties, to increase policing powers, and to exclude people from established legal rights and procedures. Often governments argue that the people encountered in certain spaces are outside the boundaries of the liberal state. Rights that are usually taken for granted are denied in these spaces. And the governments argue that these people have not legally entered the territory yet. They have not entered the territory or legally not entered the territory yet. Indefinite detention in Guantanamo, the return of refugees on the high seas, is justified by referring to the location of these places, often as beyond territory. As a consequence, fundamental constitutional rights inherent to liberal democracies are denied or limited. Of course, this is about due process, unlimited detention, access to courts, isolation, legally contestable return and rendition policies, amongst others. As said, these spaces are not outside the law, but constituted through law, normal legal tools at the disposal of the liberal state. So whilst liberal democracies on the one hand continue to operate under the rule of law and offer constitutional rights and fundamental rights, they restrict at the same time, or sometimes even suspend, the very same rights for a specific category of people at specific places. And law is of course crucial for these spaces. Law defines the borders of the state's jurisdiction, but also the borders of rights, the borders of policing, and the borders of right, good point. It can declare places under its jurisdiction to be foreign territory, expand government and policing beyond its territory, and use a legal speciality to exclude people from essential requirements of the liberal regime, access to rights. A number of different technologies are applied here to expand the legal space of government and policing beyond territory, and to contract the legal space of rights outside as well as within territory. I will take a specific example of this relationship between the ordinary law and limited rights and explore how limitation of rights is made possible on the territory of the state. This is one of the most difficult of the cases to justify for the state. I'd like to take the French waiting zone as an example to illustrate my point, the zone d'attente, to problematize the functions of law and to show how law operates in a specific case. The waiting zone is initially a concept that developed from the international zone of airports, the place that extends from the point of embarkation-debarkation to the immigration controls, a place where you probably all have gone through. The waiting zone refers to legal spaces that accommodate those who have physically arrived on the state's territory, but are not yet allowed to legally enter the state. These are special legal spaces constructed for unwelcome non-citizens, mostly for refugees and migrants. The waiting zone is on the territory of the state, and as such one would usually assume, following the logic of territorial law, that these spaces are under the state's law. And as well known, that would mean that constitutional guarantees, at the very least, should apply here. How then is the limitation of rights legally justified in these places? In the following, I will concentrate on the following aspects: the creation of these spaces through ordinary law, so not any exceptional law, lawless space or whatever, but ordinary law. Second, on the assignation of legal identities. Third, on the scope and construction of legal spaces and their relation to the physical space. And fourth, the limitation of rights. These are all fundamental aspects that illustrate how the process of limiting access to rights functions. At the same time, we'll see that this is not a linear process, but more complex, embedded in various institutional politics, integrating the agenda of various interest groups. The French waiting zone is not a unique example. It is to a good extent representative of a global phenomenon. It can be found in different legal versions at almost all international airports, seaports, international train stations. Correlates of the French waiting zone are known amongst others under names as reception centers, transit zones, or detention areas. What is common to all of them is that the legal design of these spaces legalize and increase the policing powers and limited rights for the individual, more limited than the usual constitutional rights granted by the state. This is achieved through what many refer to the myth of entry. That is the distinction created between physical presence and legal presence. People are physically on the territory of the state, but have, according to this conception, not legally entered the state. That means they don't have access to the full constitutional protection and specific protection laws of the state. As for the legal creation of the waiting zone, let me just start with the first one, and I will go through all the points point by point. As for the legal creation, waiting zones are not, as I said, are created through ordinary law. It is a common procedure of normal law to establish legal identities in legal spaces. And these tools can also be used to implement illiberal spaces that run counter to the very idea of liberal democracies. In the case of the French waiting zone, this difference is precisely between territorial borders and legal borders. A person being on French territory, but not legally within the French state. Law is a piecemeal structure here, but the law on the waiting zone has developed since the early 1980s. And in the 1980s, people who were not admitted to the territory had to stay in the international zone of airports. Those who claimed to be refugees had to be admitted, however. 1982, a decree changed the situation. Those who claimed to be refugees needed now a permit issued at the border to enter France. This is called asylum at the border and led to a number of people waiting in the international zone until their claims were assessed. A number of French NGOs denounced the situation in the international zone and questioned whether people stranded in the international zone had any rights at all. Could they be left there for days or even weeks without access to food or medical assistance? Initially, France claimed that these people were outside its territory and that French law did not apply there. A number of struggles between the governments, French NGOs, and national and regional courts in the late 1980s forced France to acknowledge that actually the international zone was within its territory. Then the law on the waiting zone came into place in 1992. It created this new legal space called the waiting zone. It was an improvement over the previous situation, but it was hardly a victory for rights. It legalized previous administrative regulations and practices on the one hand, and introduced some fundamental rights for those confined to the waiting zone on the other, but it also dogmatized the notion of legal entry, and provided those who had not legally entered with an inferior status of rights, creating a double system. This was not a purely executive or legislative decision, but the judiciary had also an important role in the design of this law. And the law on the waiting zone is constantly evolving, like any law. Waiting zones continue to be an ongoing struggle between government, the judiciary, and activists. To come back to the discourse of exception, the waiting zone is hardly an exceptional construction. And the French case suggests the view that such devices are deeply embedded in ordinary procedures of liberal democracies. What does the law on the waiting zone do? Well, first of all, it creates legal identity. Legal identification is crucial for the denial of rights. It creates and defines a population that can be excluded from the ordinary legal rights. Once a specific population has been provided a legal identity, it is an easy step to develop laws to govern specifically this population. The waiting zone is specifically created for unwanted non-citizens. It is applied to a specific population only. It singles out this group for different treatment. These are non-admitted foreigners and asylum seekers. In this regard, the law on the waiting zone specifies, quote, "The foreigner who arrives in France by rail, sea or air, and who either is not authorized to enter French territory or requests admission under the title of asylum can be held in a waiting zone." Let's ask again, what does the law on the waiting zone do? We said first, create legal identity. Second, it creates a legal space. Legal space and legal borders are very combined here. What's special about legal spaces is that they are not fixed, but very flexible constructs, and as such, multiple and in flux. They can be spatially extended and multiplied at will through ordinary law and its framework. So initially, the waiting zone was spatially fixed to the international zone at the airports and included some accommodation within the parameters of the airport. But by now it extends to all the places where the foreigner needs to be for administrative or medical reasons. Consequently, wherever a person in the waiting zone goes, and therefore we have to see it as a legal concept, he, she cannot be considered on French territory, but constantly in a particular legal space that characterizes this person as not having legally entered the territory yet. And this has, of course, important implications for their rights. So rather than containing and fixing a liberal practice, law in this sense opens up the possibility for their flexible multiplication and retrospective declaration without really having possibilities of appealing against this. Two spatial technologies are especially important here: the spatial extension of waiting zones and the multiplication of them. Let's look at the spatial extension and then at the multiplication. As I said, one of the key characteristics of the waiting zone was initially that it was spatially fixed to the international zone. That was the idea of it. That substituted prevailing administrative regulations of the old system. Quote, "The waiting zone extends from the point of embarkation and debarkation to the points where the control of people takes place." So the waiting zone appears to be physically fixed, clearly delimited initially. But incrementally, it would detach itself from the border, from the physical border, and its exceptional rights from the international zone. The process was quite simple. At the time that the law and waiting zones came into place, there was also an established administrative practice that for accommodation purposes, some people would be brought to a hotel on the grounds of the airport. The first floor of the hotel would then just be declared an international zone, meaning that people in this area had not yet entered the territory of France, legally entered the territory of France. They were outside of France. This was based on the argument of humanitarian necessity, and this shows also linkage to humanitarian claims. The waiting zone thus became detached from the international zone. This practice was inscribed into law by including accommodation within the perimeter of the port, airport, and train station. But the ultimate delocalization of borders and rights came with the 2003 amendment to the law on the waiting zone. Quote, the waiting zone extends without the necessity to take a specific decision to the places where the foreigner has to be, either in the framework of the procedure and process or in case of medical urgency. Now the waiting zone extends to all places where the foreigner needs to be. Humanitarian considerations and administrative considerations thus allow the further expansion of waiting zones. The legal status of the person comes to determine the status of the place. From this perspective, from the perspective of a non-admitted person in the waiting zone, France lost its territorial quality. Wherever he, she goes is legally outside of France. In this case, it is no longer a physical place that has rights attached to it, but a legal space, without correlation to a physical space. It is a pre-classification of people into admissible and inadmissible that determines their rights. So law does not equally apply across populations. It is legal identity that matters. The same location is inside for some people, outside for others. Also put some question marks behind equality before law. As for the multiplication, let me just point out that, of course, the framework law was used for which was used for the waiting zones, created waiting zone for ports and airports initially, and later on came to include also international train stations with international traffic. But more significant is another point. That's the undefined multiplication of border zones within the legal framework through administrative decision. Because this is granted that the prefect of each department can decide on the necessity and location of a waiting zone. So basically any prefect can decide on an area of differential rights, as well as on its precise extent. Thus, the waiting zone can potentially be created anywhere. In practice, even the concept of ports is not fixed, but can be seen as equivalent to all arrival points. So all ports on coastal areas now seem to have become possible waiting zones. Further, in the new legislation, the reference for the decision is no longer the prefect, but a competent administrative authority, thus moving the administrative burden for the creation of waiting zones even lower down the hierarchy. So rather than containing and fixing these spaces, the legislation allows the flexible multiplication of these spaces without possibilities of appealing the construction of these waiting zones, and allows even for retrospective declaration of them. The option for multiplying waiting zones, together with the possibility of their indefinite extension, demonstrate that these are sophisticated tools for government of people. The space of the waiting zone can be potentially anywhere, and create a legal identity that can potentially go anywhere. The only limit to these potentialities is a temporal limit of 20 days, that people are allowed to be in the waiting zone, or to put it differently, the possibility of escaping this legal identity after 20 days. As for the rights, and I'm slowly coming towards the end, located within the territory of the state, the waiting zone is, as I said, created primarily for refugees and unwanted migrants, and provides a set of particular rights, lesser rights, than the ordinary legal regime of liberal democracies. In the waiting zone, safeguards from detention, access to the judiciary, and rights of appeal are severely restricted legally and effectively. Hence, for example, the law effectively acknowledges that people in the waiting zone can be held under police custody for longer periods of time than even under ordinary criminal procedures. The law on the waiting zone has not only created a particular space with a set of particular rights, but also specific procedures and institutions, and facilitates options that are contrary to international refugee law and even ordinary French criminal procedures. This law does not exist in a vacuum, however. The law on the waiting zone takes the ordinary legal framework into account, but provides a watered-down version of normal territorial law. This dual legal system finds its expression in multiple components of the law: in the process of asylum at the border and the related process of return and refoulement at the border. It is also reflected in the rights accorded to those held in the waiting zone in safeguards from detention and judicial access and rights of appeal. As I said, waiting zones are not unique, so this is not just the one case I'm looking at. It's a specific case, but it's not the only one. Other legal constructs operate under similar rationales. It's a commonly used, sophisticated technique for the illiberal government of people in liberal democracies. You will find, for example, that territorial waters are not considered as being legally within the United States. Or you found in Australia for a long time that a number of its islands, offshore installations, and parts even of its mainland were considered not to be legally part of Australian territory. For specific people, of course. As a consequence, these people did not have access to fundamental rights, usually granted. Within this construction, in principle, liberal democracies grant fundamental rights to everybody, but some people just can never come under the scope of the law, even if they are on the territory. Now, law is, of course, hardly a new tool of governing differently, and it is not solely applied to foreigners in this way. We know the case of legal segregation based upon race or anti-terrorism measures, which are long-standing precursors, and are also operating on the idea of legal identities, legal spaces, and lesser fundamental rights. And even for Guantanamo, which I'm not going to explain here right now, but which is commonly seen as a paradigm of an exceptional space, a further analysis of its historical constitution shows that this legal space was created through a mixture of executive interpretation, but also through the judiciary and their decisions. It shows how the control of populations is routinized and how unequal access to fundamental rights is a defining feature of the legal state. I'd like to summarize the points, a few points as a way of concluding under the heading Security, Law and States. The first point is on security. So, the discourse of exception that separates liberal from the illiberal rule in liberal democracies, as if both belong to different times and space with a clear boundary line between them, is questionable. These spaces are established by means of regular legal process and practices of legal identification and legal bordering. So in that sense, security appears to be part of a normal mode of government in the repertoire. These zones, these legal spaces, are characterized by legal proliferation rather than being outside the law, by judicial complicity rather than executives acting on their own, and often also international consensus rather than unilateral approaches by the states. Second point on borders. The border is often portrayed as a static border, physically fixed. A boundary is drawn between the state, delimited by its territory, and the outside. From a legal perspective, we have to also question that. The state's borders are actually multiple, shifting and fluid, and their location depends on the population to be governed. In this sense, the state is not really a territorially fixed entity. Its borders are in constant transformation, negotiation, and contestation, and sovereignty possibly gains its full power precisely through the possibility to define its legal borders, the space of its legal jurisdiction and the space of its legal right. The possibility to expand and contract legal borders is a technique that states use to create border zones of limited rights, and two legal borders are of importance here: the legal borders of policing and the legal border of rights. And it is precisely their separation that opens up possibilities for creating spaces with lesser rights. The third point is on law. Many contemporary analyses focus on exceptional law, state of exception, extra-legal approaches, lawless spaces, And again, each of these approaches plays illiberal rule outside of ordinary rule of law and assumes somehow a distinction between a normal law as a base of the liberal state and limitation of rights as an exception to this norm. The production and control of space and identities are fundamental to the art of government, and law is productive. Law is productive in creating inside-outside, placing certain people in outside spaces, creating border zones and other space where fundamental rights can be limited, but powers of policing upheld. Law's most powerful tools are also its most ordinary tools. The creation of legal identities, the creation of legal spaces, legal borders, and the definition of the scope of these rights. It is hardly surprising that law constructs borders, produces identities, regulates these, marks legal spaces, criminalizes and grants rights. These are normal tools of law, and they are also used in our context. Therefore, these areas, these spaces, can be easily produced and reproduced without resorting to any exceptional tools of government. I'd like to end the presentation with an appeal just to pay attention to the various functions of law and the ambivalent relation of law and rights that should lead us to question common sense assumptions about law and place an emphasis on investigating the effects of it. Basically, a turn to the politics of law.
Okay, welcome. As Peter said, my name is Nicolas. I would like to pretty much build on what we've just heard, which I fully agree and found extremely interesting to listen to. What we do as Amnesty International is kind of look at the individual cases, so to speak, or the general policy changes, the practice, so to speak, of how these discourses actually impact on people. And that's what I want to look at. And I think while I do that, it'd be very good to keep in mind the things that you just outlined in the sense of these extra legal spaces, or the way of trying to create different types of legal identities that then actually allow us to violate what we would generally call human rights. There's certainly a principle behind that, which has to do with the sort of idea that this liberal idea of rights is in the first place problematic. However, that is what we base our human rights discourse on, and that is what the organization I work for bases its discourse on, because it's the only tool we have. And it's sometimes very critical, or sometimes very difficult, with that acknowledgement of saying that is the tool we have, that's what we're going to claim, so we're claiming the rule of law. However, we actually acknowledge that some of the principal concepts behind it are different. Okay. So first of all, quite quickly, Amnesty International, we kind of 2.2 million people in the world in about 150 countries, and it's very much kind of centered, as I just said, around the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that's sort of the reference framework in which we are traditionally moved. We're currently kind of moving a little bit into the economic, cultural, social and cultural sphere, which is also part of the international component on economic, cultural and social rights. However, that is a shift into acknowledging a little bit more the intricacies and not just coming back to this equality before the law. Sure. Okay, so one of the key aspects of what we do, as most of you probably know, is it's an activism based. It's a movement. It's not an NGO as such, it's a movement. And so there's a lot of this demonstrations, letter writings, this is where it comes from, the videos, the kind of mass action, and that taking up of individual cases. That is, we've also what we call the campaigning aspect, and I'm going to come back to that again in the context of the European Union. We have a European Union office, which is soon going to be called the European Institutions Office, broadening out towards the Council of Europe. But that was founded in 1985. It's located here in Brussels, and it's funded and governed by the European sections, the Amnesty International sections in Europe. Okay, what do we do? And this is kind of maybe just very quickly interesting for what I'm going to talk about in a second. So we do indirect lobbying. It's kind of quite clear, but the idea is to kind of go into both sides. So we basically feed back into our movement, into the Amnesty movement, whatever there are in terms of opportunities or developments, and that will often contain pointing out certain discourses or certain changes, or what we feel where the sort of political wind is in the end actually going, and how we need to be vigilant in order to watch that. And then obviously, as I said, we do the lobby work, we kind of try and do direct advocacy, and we're trying to filter in whatever Amnesty does in terms of research, which is what it traditionally is, back into the institutions. Okay. Why should Amnesty target the EU on human rights? The point is, for us, that there are two areas. One is we still have and still see massive human rights violations in the EU member states. Now, obviously, in a sort of press context or political context, I'm often asked, am I comparing what's happening within the EU with what's happening in Africa, for example? No. However, somebody who has their rights violated, as, for example, particularly migrants or asylum seekers are experiencing, is not going to be interested in that comparison, because the rights violation hurts the same everywhere. And a police bat on your hat hurts you whether you're Chinese, American, or European. It doesn't actually matter. So that's a really key thing, and we'll come back to that. That's not news to any of us, but what are the sort of key things here is, for us, kind of particularly racism, discrimination, this issue around migration, violence against women, and then still quite a number of quite a lot of violence of law enforcement officials. And we still have mock executions in countries like Austria for people who are supposed to be deported. One example we had last year. So this is happening. The other issue is obviously that the EU has increasing competence to adopt laws in areas that are very crucial to that human rights. Here, particularly asylum and migration policies, and this is where these kinds of things play in, because these concepts that some of the states have developed individually are becoming more and more the sort of standards. The member states are seeking to find these justifications, these extra legal spaces, the reduction of rights as a joint thing, and then the flip back of that is quite easily, as we can see, the hiding of the local politicians or the national politicians behind, this is a decision at the EU, it was a majority decision at the EU, we have so this massive investment in borders, for example, the EU spends billions every year on border control. We spend hardly anything on integration. So these things is where it is happening, the migration debate and the actual these kind of discourses and the point where you need to make the point, it's here in Brussels. The other issue where it also is back to the same thing, sort of connected discourses, counterterrorism, and then the whole judicial or police cooperation. These are the sort of areas where we're getting the use getting stronger and stronger, and so we feel this is where we need to have some discussions that are traditionally discussions that you hold within a nation state. They're no longer held there, they're held in Brussels, and there these member state officials are all by themselves, and they're not watched. This is intransparent, and it's very difficult for the electorate in a democracy locally to even influence any of these things. What's the reality, actually, of the internal thing? I mean, basically there is no possibility within the EU to talk about internal human rights violations. None. Zero. There is something that's called Article 7. Those of you who do law and EU law will know about this. But there's an absolute taboo of peer review. It hasn't been used. There's this gentleman's agreement that it will never be used. There are sometimes little signs of it kind of resurfacing. But basically the thing is words on paper. Another thing is then there was Big Bang in school. We have a fundamental rights agency for the EU. It was not allowed to monitor human rights within member states. However, it hasn't actually got an address, so it produces very, very good reports. And if you're interested in these areas, it's a very good output they're making. However, nobody's obliged to read them. So there's no address in the European Council where these reports are being sent. Or actually somebody has to respond or say, well, this is what the EU is going to do about the problem. None of this is done. So there's basically no internal human rights mechanism. And then there's this sort of ping-pong game between the Commission and the Council mainly, and occasionally the European Parliament about whose job it is to talk about these issues. And then obviously the EU has got a big PR problem, but I'm not going to go into that. You know that. Okay. So, from our point of view, basically the principal key issue that we're seeing is this whole. There seems to have been a territory that seemed to be clear. And it was within the liberal ideology, clearly. It was the sort of equality before the law. There were certain issues like torture in Europe, which were just commonly agreed understandings that it can't happen. There are no exceptions to this. And this is actually something that did hold just until that moment when the renditions happened. And we actually had very extra legal spaces in countries like Poland, where we had Spain, Portugal, UK, Germany involved in the CIA flights. So all of a sudden there was torture on European territory, and it was actually okay, and it wasn't talked about, and it's still not investigated. So there is something that seems to be breaking at the moment, which is the sort of, the problem was there before already, given the ideological problem that is there in liberal law. However, now we're actually going to spaces where this is being used in order to create more and more of these types of exceptions. And that's what we at Amnesty International call the sort of securitization of rights. So all of a sudden this issue of security, which is the topic of today, is becoming the guiding principle. And it's a sort of analysis of, it's a sort of needle in the haystack ideology, as I call it. They kind of say, well, if you need to find the needle in the haystack in terms of terrorists, then you just have to go and get rid of the whole haystack, otherwise. And that is, in all seriousness, top officials, both in the Council as well as in the Commission, using these images to justify that, for example, a database like Eurodac, where asylum seekers' fingerprints are taken, is made open to police in Europe. Now, there are a number of massive problems with that. One is obviously the assumption that asylum seekers are likely to be more criminal than others. There's no proof for that, but that's the assumption behind it. They're more likely to be terrorists. There's no proof for that. And it directly threatens their livelihood and the livelihood of their families. Because there is the other counterterrorism legislation that fits with it that says that law enforcement officials in the European Union can cooperate with whoever they want on policing, including Pakistan, for example. Now, any Pakistani asylum seeker and their family are immediately threatened. But within that whole thing of we need to find that needle in the haystack, and it doesn't matter if the rest of the haystack has no rights. It's exactly that. That is definitely on the increase, and is on the increase in that sort of daily Brussels speak. Another area that we work particularly on that connects, and all of these things connect with it, is asylum migration. Particularly there, what we're seeing is sort of more and more criminalization of migrants. So the idea that all of a sudden entering a territory illegally is no longer an administrative offense, it's actually a criminal offense. So other countries are moving into that direction. Italy. The investment in border control, we talked about that. The other thing is very interesting, I guess most of you will be aware of this, but we have a huge reduction in terms of migrants and asylum seekers in the EU. The EU is almost not reachable anymore. If you look at a country like Germany, at the end of the 90s, there were still about 400,000 refugees that came. We're now down to something like 20,000. That's not even 5%. So this whole the boat is full, it's actually crap. It's less and less and less. It's just that people choose more and more dangerous routes to arrive. Because they will, because they're desperate, because they're coming out of situations like Somalia or Darfur or Eritrea where life is just not possible. Then the other big area that we have, and that's something I'm going to look at a little bit more in detail, is discrimination. And here we are particularly looking at issues in relationship to lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people we're focusing on Roma, focusing on faith-based discrimination, and then on migrants again. And you will see it does get a sort of red thread in terms of this argument of the deterioration of rights that we see. And the last area is police brutality, here again. So we're trying to kind of address these issues. And for me, they are actually quite interconnected, and that's not usually seen. Right. Are we going for time? Just to give you 2 minutes of the reality of this. We've just recently seen a law in Lithuania that puts information to teenagers in schools on homosexuality at the same level as positively teaching them about suicide or violation of corpses, pedophilia, and a whole other things that are and should be excluded from curricula. So this is kind of quite outrageous. And again, we're seeing a sort of standard that we thought we had, that were part of the Copenhagen criteria, discrimination, etc. All of a sudden, we're going backwards. And interestingly, here again, freedom of expression, as there's identities created by the state in a retrospective way that kind of keeps society safe. So this whole security thing comes in. It's one side is migrants and terrorism, and the other side is dealing with those minorities that we don't want and we can't cope with and can't deal with. The EU is almost incapable of reacting to these things. I mean, the Lithuanian law was addressed, and it wasn't addressed by the Swedish presidency, but nevertheless. So freedom of expression, and it's not only Lithuania. We're looking at a lot of these pride marches being prevented, etc. There are actually still situations that most of us don't know about, is, for example, for transgender people. There's still a group in European society who, by law, is required to be rendered infertile. Okay? So we still have forced sterilization of Roma women, for example, but it's not legal. Okay? This is a violation of current law. It happens, no question, but it's not legal. For transgender people, it's legally enforced. So these are issues. There's no access to healthcare, there's massive discrimination, 80% job loss, never gets a job again. It's a small group, but it kind of culminates a certain system. So there's a lot of work to be done in Europe that is quite fundamental on this area. We're trying to campaign on this more than we used to before. The second example I want to give on the situation is around Roma people. Again, most of you will be familiar with the principle. We're particularly looking at housing, education. So there's still a number of member states who segregate Roma children immediately into schools for disabled children or socially handicapped children, never giving them any chance to go out. There are sort of principal issues where EU structural funds are, for example, used to build new settlements for Roma, but they're built so far out. And then it's forgotten that actually needs sewage and electricity, and that there's no public transport. So virtually or practically creating a ghetto. And EU money is being used in order to do these kinds of things. Then obviously we know the kind of right-wing movement and the Roma attacks. And there's a very interesting connection here. I don't know whether you know about the Italian security package. Here the word comes back again. Which, through very interesting back doors, comes in and says that anybody who doesn't have a permanent address in a housing situation that is of common standard is no longer legal. So, and this actually pertains to EU citizens. So these people cannot register, and in order to vote, you have to be registered locally. In order to access a school, you have to be registered locally. In order to get health care and health insurance, you have to be registered locally. Most Roma people cannot register anymore. So they couldn't vote in the European Parliament election. EU citizens. So there's this sort of, Italy's particularly good at the moment at this, trying to create these spaces, these extra spaces, or trying to prevent certain people by very common and easy tricks. I mean, this is not new. We've seen this all over the place. But it's this way, and again, the discourse that is used for it is we're keeping Italian society safe from Roma theft, from Roma violence, and so forth. So that's background. And it particularly hits Roma, and particularly hits irregular migrants, who quite clearly do not have common standard housing because they live in decrepit buildings. Okay. Now, there is another sort of, and I keep kind of trying to make this connection. I don't know whether it sits entirely right for all of you. That the example that we've seen that was Tugba given on the migration issue, where this whole connection with terrorism and secularization is absolutely obvious. It's in plain view. It's very easy to see. I actually think this sort of discrimination aspect is equally, it's around the question of why we're actually seeing a deterioration here as well, which is interesting because it should be, this is about EU citizens mostly. Why are we seeing a sort of the standards going down quite so massively as we do? The EU is actually, if you want to mention, from our point of view, if you want to mention one thing that the EU is unequivocally being fantastic about, it's setting anti-discrimination standards. It's the one thing that we say, brilliant. And with all the new member states in 2005, where it belonged to the Copenhagen criteria, it was never negotiated. The only thing Poland wanted to negotiate was the inclusion of sexual orientation in the anti-discrimination law. They weren't allowed to. So this was a real important thing. Then we also had, just before the last commission, this absolute super highlight of the European Parliament, where they actually turned down the whole of the commission because of the Italian proposed commissioner, who was so homophobic and anti-women that they didn't think he should be holding the justice portfolio. Bucciglione, his name was. For us, this was a sort of star moment of the European Parliament, where for once they actually asked the right questions, and for once they were willing to make a principled standpoint. This has led, in a sort of attempt of Barroso to safeguard his commission and to still have a commission. He promised that there would be new anti-discrimination legislation and a group of fundamental rights commissions. Now the commission fell, Bucciglione was exchanged. However, this promise was standing. And right until sort of the very, very last moment, 2008, in summer 2008, the commission finally came out with this new anti-discrimination proposal. Which was weak, but acceptable. Now, what is interesting about it is, it should have been, what it is doing is basically you have this horizontal directive on gender, this horizontal directive on race, and you have all the other grounds only for employment. Now, what it does, it creates equality before the law, in that sense of saying, well, there's the same protection for everybody, no matter on what basis. Okay? So what it does, it extends these grounds that were restricted to employment, age, religion, sexual orientation, belief, disability, into that more horizontal thing. And we thought it should be an easy ride. Now it isn't at all. In actual fact, we're either going to get a directive that is so watered down that it's completely meaningless, particularly for disabled people, that is creating exceptions that are from here to Alaska. What we're seeing now is sort of exceptions kind of stating the kind of obvious, this constant reiteration of marital law and knowing sort of restrictions on sexual orientation. So these are the two things. We've seen massive debates about, is the state allowed to enforce the ban on headscarves in schools? So there's a whole this whole debate that we're having around how we're dealing with diversity in the European Union is coming back up here. And it's dealt with in a manner that is really, it's shameful. These debates in the Council are shameful. Nothing else. So they're really trying to cop out at the moment, and not even the Swedish presidency is going to push this through. But we're actually going to try and get very loud about it. And name and blame and shame for the first time in Amnesty's history states directly. And that's what we're doing this with a non-discrimination campaign across Europe, which the EU directive is an important one. Yes, the criminal justice system, faith-based discrimination is going to be an important one, where there's very, very little research across Europe about how this is happening. And we're also one of the very few who can actually have fairly clear standards on this sort of headscarf ban and carrying of religious symbols. And then obviously sexual orientation and gender identity, whereas the gender identity side of things is also for Amnesty very weak. It's something that we need to build up on. Then Roma and migration centers. That's going to be our key thing. And now, Right, 5 minutes. I want to make a bit of a jump away from this, what I just said, because so you have this sort of secularization or the deterioration of the rights contexts, and this whole kind of, it almost seems like this liberal legal concept is sort of imploded in itself. It always had a problem. It's now showing its problem quite clearly. But that, for us, quite importantly, obviously also relates to how the EU is doing external. So, again, the EU is an extremely important international player, which is why the human rights approach to it has to be there. And this is why, in our office, for example, we have about 60–70% of our work is focused on the external relations rather than the internal. We're very, very small, restricted on the internal side. So, you know about this biggest development donor. It has, by now, huge civilian and military capacities on missions. It exports a third of the world's arms. So, again, it's a very important tool. And it's 27 countries who act as a bloc on issues like security, counterterrorism, enlargement, labor policy, etc. Very quickly, and I don't know how familiar with these things, just so you see what the mechanisms are that are there. So the structured human rights dialogues, the whole accession process, which is very important for human rights standards. There are things like human rights clauses in all of the agreements, trade agreements as well, development agreements. There are very important human rights guidelines. Key ones, first one's the torture guidelines, the guidelines on human rights defenders, etc. Something new on violence against women, there are 6 of them. There's support to the International Criminal Court. And then there's something that is called the GSP+. I'm not going to go into it. It's a sort of preferential trade system. And this is where, again, this whole rights context is getting quite complicated because Sri Lanka has it. It provides a lot of employment for people who fare at the bottom of society. It's meant to be suspended on the course of human rights violations. We are not actually sure that we are for this because it almost smokes of a sanction that will hit exactly those people whose rights have been violated. So that's just a little side. And then obviously the ESDP missions that are there. Now, where's the problem here? And this is the point sort of coming into this internal and external nexus. So as I said before, there's no respond. So this is making it increasingly difficult. Obviously, countries like Russia or China who use this in a detrimental way. No question against any kind of dialogue, against being told about this absolutely massive and atrocious human rights violations in Russia, for example. So that's one problem. But the problem in itself is that the EU has no mechanism to respond in a way of at least acknowledging, saying, hey, yes, we acknowledge that's a problem. And here's what we're doing about it. Do you want to have a skill exchange of how human rights violations can be addressed? That's at least the minimum response they need to have to. There's absolutely no coherence, and with that, the torture issue, the fact that we still don't know about the renditions. So you can actually watch, if you follow these external relations, you can watch deterioration. You can watch the EU's role decreasing at the UN. You can just see it going down, and the connection. On the one hand is obviously the abuse that some countries like Russia, for example, do with it. But on the other hand, there is just sort of that idea of you are not even capable of telling us how you're addressing your own violations. Why are you talking to us? And then obviously the whole secularization before diversity nexus that also comes into the external side. And I could extend on this one, but basically this whole red thread that I was trying to draw is pulling through internal and external. And it feels almost, watching this from a sort of lobbyist perspective, as if we're sort of close to a culmination point. Either we're still going to get across the corner at some point, or we're going to at some point have to acknowledge that what we always thought as human rights activists as well was the common standard of Europe is no longer the common standard, and is also no longer legally justified. And that's where sort of it seems like we're now sort of at a dividing line, needing to watch where this whole thing's going. Okay, that's it.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, I think these talks go really, really well together, and I'm grateful to both. In some sense, Nicolas, you fill in what Tugba is exploring the liberal origins of these problems. You, in your very first line, said we have to take that as a given, and then what happens? What are the consequences within that framework? So I think that they're very much woven together. The floor is open. And I can ask a question which has been bothering me the whole time here, as we're waiting for you to get up your courage. And it's about the collectivization of rights or the individualization of rights in this situation where we have what you both talked about as securitization of migration in one form or another. Is there an effect of moving the rights focus from the individual level to a more collective level? Is there a collectivization when you talk about the way that law creates categories, constitutes groups? Is that at the expense of the individual? So that we're not talking about individual security anymore, we're talking about collective groups. And they don't necessarily need to be ethnic groups like the Roma, but groups, and that the individual is somehow lost. And I guess in a more applied way, would you see that too? Do you see a bit more complex than what we just call some kind of racism or ethnic prejudice? A loss of the focus and the old-fashioned idea that rights are individual, and they're being sort of taken away from the individual and ascribed to groups, which then blur the distinction between individuals. Any comment on that?
No, thanks for the question. Well, I think you need to collectivize to securitize maybe to an extent. It doesn't mean that the individual, to exempt people from certain rights, precisely giving an identity to them, is already the first step for collectivization. For discrimination in general, you need to be able to name. And I think in that sense, yes, it does go very much to the very idea of collectivization. I think so, absolutely. I thought. I would agree, actually.
I mean, the concept of discrimination, protection from discrimination, has a certain collective aspect to it. But always under this idea that it is the individual who has the right and who can make the right applicable. So there's, remedy and access to legal remedy. And if you look at the tradition of an organization like Amnesty, it's exactly where it comes in. It stays entirely within that discourse, and it still does. I mean, we're still talking, we still constantly, every second or third week, writing letters on, the clarification of human rights violations on individual cases that happened 40 years ago. And we still want, and we're also not going to let go of Antijan and these kinds of issues. So it's always that claim back to the individual people concerned need to have redress and justice and access to justice. But that obviously stays within, the big philosophical question is what's justice there, and what is it going to give? And this is where, previous incarnations of peace building and conflict prevention debate is very interesting because it's a little bit more about this collective approach, or the possibility of redress and justice as a collective. Now, and I think this is a very dangerous one because if you follow this entirely, then you're obviously breaking open this whole legal framework of the individual rights holder, which I don't think we can afford. But this is exactly what I'm saying. I think we're at a sort of culmination point where this is going to be interesting to see. Are we still willing to base ourselves on a principle of that individual rights holder? Or will we eventually move much more to the Chinese model, which we don't even know?
I mean, you see this, just to carry on, you see this in this really nice illustration you had in Nicolas of Italy, where the state, or at least the late modern state, is a bureaucratic one, and the identity of the citizen is a bureaucratic one. You have to be on the books, essentially. And then if you don't meet the criteria you were describing, then you're off the books, and you disappear into the clouds of this collective, non-right holding group. Your individuality is lost because you don't have an address, essentially, or a voting record. Please.
Pretty much just following up what you said. in order to regain access to rights, you would have to go and appeal against the decision made in first instance and kind of try and climb up the hierarchical order of decision making, or of justice rather. And that kind of seems to be difficult to kind of say, like, to get back into the normal state where rights are guaranteed from the kind of legal space, legal identity, where there were restricted rights. So in order to kind of shift your legal identity, you really need to make a big effort, and you kind of have to, how can I say? It's not, I mean, the decision for your legal identity as being an asylum seeker and a rejected asylum seeker, for example, is made at first instance, but after you have to go up, even though you're claiming to become normal and not exception anymore.
There's a threshold you have to
yes.
come over up.
And it's in the wrong direction, sort of, because it's easier to be in the exception than it is to be in the normal case.
I mean, I think the whole question of justiciability comes in here. You know, how you actually get access to it, and that particularly is obviously a legally quite complicated thing in the area of economic, cultural, and social rights. You know, the whole political and civil rights. We have this concept, and even there we currently see through these sort of loopholes of creating different identities for people that don't have access to things. We're denying them those things. But the political and civil rights. But the whole issue of, you know, where do you turn to, what instance do you go to, and how can you become a person that can make his or her way up through the instances becomes highly problematic as soon as you go into other fields of international rights, economic, cultural, social rights. And this is, interestingly enough, very, very much a gender issue as well, to say this one, because if you look at people who work, human rights defenders, for example, 80 to 90% of women human rights defenders will work on economic, cultural, and social rights, okay, and have traditionally been very sidelined and have had very little access. There's a connection here between who works for whose rights and who's got access to, and where the thresholds are, and what's the emphasis internationally in the human rights discourse.
No, please.
Here you've been speaking, and I'm addressing Mr. Nicolas here, on what EU policy is doing wrong, where they have weak faults. So then I have a tendency to ask, what would you suggest that they do? It's easy to say something is wrong, but how can they improve? Because I go from the old saying, one rotten apple spoils the basket. If you look at individuals, you will see good, bad. But if you have to make a policy, you make it for the whole basket. So how could they improve? What would be your advice to them to make it better?
I have this running joke with Solana's representative on human rights, Lena Klonka, who keeps saying that whenever we sit on the same panel, she seems to be doing nothing right. That's obviously not the case, particularly as it pertains to her. But there are a number of instruments the EU has that are very, very good in the external field. For example, the Human Rights Defender Guidelines. Let's take one of these things. And they're actually sometimes, not everywhere, but sometimes member states will get actually quite serious about this. And where there's some initiatives that are absolutely wonderful. But then, interestingly, again, to just take that example, which is a very good example. You have these good guidelines, you have very good activities on the ground by embassies. And then this Czech presidency tried to do a project that was suggested to them by Frontline, which was an NGO on human rights defense. They tried to implement a project called Shelter Cities, where some cities within the EU participate in that project, and they will take maybe one person a year, and they will provide healthcare, social benefit, and accommodation for that person for maybe 3 months, maybe 6 months, when people have to leave in an extreme situation before they're being killed. Now, just in the last 3 months, we've lost 10 Russian human rights defenders. The Russian authorities are going down a list. They're being murdered one after the other. And where this thing is stuck now, it's a really, really good initiative. There are a number of cities who are willing to participate. Where it's stuck now is with the interior ministers, because they're as completely crazy and scared that these people will stay, they will ask for asylum. Now, all statistics say that we were talking about maybe for the whole of the EU, maybe 20, 25 people a year, maximum, that would participate in that scheme. The known human rights defenders on immediate threats, etc., etc. Now, 25 asylum seekers. Who cares? And also, 24 of those will not, because that's what they do, and they want to go back. That's the experience and the statistics and the work that the Council of Europe does with them, for example. It's absolutely clear. So this is where there's some really good initiatives, some really good stuff, and then it gets exactly hit on this securitarization thing. It's when the interior ministers come in, this whole threat of, oh my god, there are going to be another 25 people coming to the EU, we don't want them. I mean, this is where it touches the ridiculous. This is what also gets obviously frustrating for those people in the institutions who do really good work. Another example I gave you was the discrimination side. It's good. It's fantastic, in fact. The standard setting was the discrimination legislation in 2000 was fantastic. Now, what they're doing now is embarrassing. So it's sort of that, you criticize, but there are. It's not like everything is horrible, but you do need to. And what I would say they need to do is they need to have an internal human rights mechanism. And we've been saying this for the last 15 years. They have to implement a internal human rights mechanism, and otherwise they'll lose probably 80% of their external impact as well. So it is simple. An address for the Fundamental Rights Agency to send the reports to. Somebody who has to reply. That's already a mechanism.
Nothing else on our minds?
But what you just talked about, isn't that more a national problem in EU decision making, and maybe some states fear that the particular problems they have in their own states could become addressed on a European level. So shouldn't you do more, be doing lobbying work on a national level in these cases rather than on the European level?
We're one of the few organizations who actually have sections in almost all of the European member states. So we are in a very privileged position in terms of doing this sort of combined lobby work. But no, whether the EU has competency or non-discrimination, it has competency, there's no question. Article 13 of the Amnesty Treaty provides the competency for discrimination. And so there's no question of this directive not falling under EU law. It obviously excludes those things that are member states' competency. That's normal. However, at the moment, the draft states all of these things, which is unnecessary. EU law can never apply to things that are member state laws. So that's exactly the argument, for example, Germany is making. Is they have a discrimination law, so that's fine, and it's pretty okay. They don't want any more EU stuff coming, and so they're just blocking. So it's a sort of navel-gazing of individual states, where Germany might not need the EU to pass another discrimination legislation. In fact, it doesn't. Nor does Denmark, nor does Sweden. Come to France, we're already getting difficult. The Netherlands still alright, but everything after that is shoddy. Go east, go south. We need that legislation, and that's exactly where there's sort of national interests. This is our claim to them. Your national interest has to stand behind what needs to happen for the whole of the region, and the standard setting that goes with it. So again, it's in practice it's always a play of there's certain issues that we don't get involved in at all from the European level because there's no EU competence. So we're pretty legal in that sense. We kind of go along with what there is. But asylum migration is huge to the EU area.
Just a shift of focus, maybe. When you talked about, Basaran, when you talked about legal space being created, I was kind of expecting something to hear, like precisely the word of carrier sanctions or carrier responsibility that has been kind of the policy to externalize the responsibility for procedures. Maybe if you have some thoughts about that, how that links in with legal spaces, legal identities, and the responsibility for the people in the legal space and identity being created.
to be honest, I have to. Most of the things linked to this, that you do need to have a legal identity and a legal space for actually promoting certain policing powers, because otherwise you cannot legalize policing powers. So basically what you're doing is often that precisely you're saying, all right, we have to have some kind of cooperation law, and you give the police certain rights, and you just do not give the same rights for the individual. So it fits into a lot of different concepts. And the example which I have given was just concentrated on the waiting zone, for making it very clear how it functions on the territory of the state. But we could look at a number of different concepts, certainly, and it would be a different version of the argument, but I thought this was like the most visible argument. That's why I did concentrate on that.
I think another really great one for this one is this whole debate about Italy sending people they pick up on sea directly back to Libya.
Yeah.
It's another, legally speaking, does the Geneva Convention on Refugees count on international water, or doesn't it? Is this refoulement? Is the Maritime Convention observed? And there's a very interesting legal argument that Amnesty is currently having with the European Commission on this, where our legal analysis goes, and it's been thoroughly made, and not just checked by one lawyer, but whole teams, and we have an organisation with many lawyers. So, where, at what point, this is international water, we think the Geneva Convention holds anywhere. So it's not a territorial issue, it's a global issue. And then at what point Italian officials who were meant to be proposing, meant to be protecting what Italy is a signatory to, at what point is this refoulement? It is, in our opinion, it's strict and direct refoulement. Libya torture, Libya refuse, you cannot send people back to Libya, full stop. But the whole point is, the Commission is saying that as long as Italy hasn't asked these people whether they want to seek asylum, they're not yet in the responsibility of the Geneva Convention in terms of giving access to a fair procedure. Now, it's very legally intricate and very complicated, but this is where we see another one of where we sort of, the attempt to create a space. And now Italy's argument was international water, not Italian territory, who cares, we'll just send them back. Good question, what happened to the 70 people of which only 3 survived, that were the 3 that survived and were in the water had Maltese life vests on. This is where you also get an interesting, this is more the Maritime Safety Convention here, and the space of that. Now that's a bit clearer legally speaking, but we are actually looking at attempts, quite open attempts by state to even on this rescue level create spaces where some people are not less worth being rescued than others.
And there also, we have obviously legal cases of Tugba, etc., which are precisely pointing towards penalization of rescue efforts. And that is even an open way of criminalization almost, and thus even changing moral norms which have prevailed so far as regards rescue and who's allowed to be rescued. Now you would actually have to ask, well, am I allowed to rescue you? Because if you're an asylum seeker, let me think about it once more.
Yeah. Please die.
But it's on the high seas especially. It's a very, very important issue, I agree, and it has been also it's evolved from a lot of memoranda of understanding between countries. So you have bilateral agreements which allow you to police on the high seas and even in the territorial waters of the other state. Now, of course, in these agreements you're lacking the rights aspect. So what are the rights of those interdicted? So you do have policing powers, because that is established between 2 countries, but the rights aspect is being lost, absolutely, I agree. And you have that also, for example, between the US and Haiti, that was in the 80s, much earlier version of this, when there were interdicted Haitian refugees, or as they like to call them, migrants.
Or Spain and Mauritania, no? Where they also have this agreement where Mauritania is
Italy, Albania.
Is detaining people who might, maybe, without proof, try to seek to cross over to Spain. So they detain them, and then they just dump them in the desert without food and clothing beyond that border. without actually having established whether they ever had an intention to try. And that detention center is straight financed by Spain. So, very interesting. So there's a sort of, there are these agreements where there's a sort of controlled policing, detention and finance going, but in that nothing talks about right. Italy and Libya, the whole Mediterranean, the whole outsourcing of the EU of its asylum and reception centers into Africa. I mean, we're going as far as Tom and Russet right now. We're way into the desert. That's where the EU has its furthest reception center. So it's a sort of more and more where you have these, in international law, you have these agreements, but they exclude certain things which ought to be holding, because, the Geneva Convention says everybody has to have an access to a fair system, asylum system. So it's a really, I really do think that we're at this point, and it is about, this is why I find it so massively interesting how you were looking at this whole point about, before, if you reach territory, you are safe. There was this whole globalization in terms of technology and all this sort of, the world is becoming a much, much smaller space, but the safe territory is disappearing. So it becomes more an identity that is attached to us as individuals, that either keeps us safe or doesn't keep us safe, and there's no escape. So in a way, this is a very intricate change of system that we're seeing here.
Oh, very good. On that very interesting but a little bit discouraging summary there. I think we'll call it an evening. Thank you very much for being here, and let me remind you that you're warmly welcome next week when we'll talk about citizenship with Jeff Huysmans from the Open University of London, but a native child of Leuven, I think, if I'm not mistaken. But first, thanks to our panel, Tugba, Basaran and Nicolas